Hello there. Thanks for joining us for the BookBound 2020, a From Home Literary Festival. My name is Paul McVeigh, and I'm here to join in conversation with Alex Wheatle and Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett. This event has been created in partnership with Wasafiri magazine to raise money for the UK-based mental health charity Mind. Mind provides advice and support to empower people experiencing mental health problems. Their statistics show that on average, 1 to 4 people will experience a mental health problem in a typical year, and 2020 is not a typical year. You can make a donation to support Mind using the link to the BookBound Just Giving page displayed below. You can find out more about BookBound, Wasafiri, Mind, and us authors here by visiting our website on bookbound2020.co.uk. And now on to our event, and we'll introduce ourselves to you. And I'll start. My name is Paul McVeigh. I'm from Belfast, so I grew up in a working class area of Belfast that was crowned the biggest slum in Europe when I was growing up there. And from there, I moved to London, and I wrote plays and then short stories, then a novel, and then I've been working on helping other working class writers make it or give them opportunities anyway. And currently that is by editing a book called The 32, which is the Irish version of Kit Duvall's Common People anthology. Thank you very much. Alex?
Right, I was born in South London. Most of my childhood was spent in a Surrey children's home. Funny enough, the orphanage was located in a very middle-class area, but at the age of 14, I returned to Brixton, and I began my creative life as a sound system DJ. I used to love reggae and going to raves and all-night parties. Absolute fan of Bob Marley and Dennis Brown. And then I guess because I had so much rage in my chest, I started to express myself in poetry and spoken word. And then my first novel, Brixton Rock, was published in 1999.
Rhiannon?
Yeah, great to meet you guys. My name's Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett, and I am a novelist and journalist. I grew up in Snowdonia in a small Welsh village. I was born in London, but I spent most of my childhood in Wales. Most of it after my parents split up with my mum and my brother, who's severely autistic. So I was a carer from quite a young age for my brother, had a single mum. And when I left school, I spent some time living in France, and then finally I moved to London, having also spent a brief period of time living in Italy as well. And I got my break in journalism, partly from entering a competition and partly from a blog that I set up. So that was kind of my route into publishing. I don't think I'd have ended up writing novels if it hadn't been for that. So great to meet you both.
Great to meet you too.
Yeah. Can I just ask you about that, Rhiannon? Because why do you think you wouldn't have ended up writing novels if it hadn't been for that?
Well, I think I would have written novels, but I don't know if they'd have ever ended up being published. I suppose that's the difference. I think, I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but I certainly found when I was taking my first novel around different publishers as part of the submission process, and I'd already written one non-fiction book before that as well, I found that your profile was quite important to editors. And I think the fact that I was already a journalist really helped with that. And it really gave me, I'd say, an insight into how difficult it must be if you're a young writer and you don't have a public profile at all, or you don't have any journalistic background. So much of it seems to be sold on that now. If you kind of look at, particularly like people who are like Instagram influencers now who have millions of followers and stuff like that, they seem to really take that into account. So I think that that was definitely a factor. And also not having any connections in the publishing industry or in journalism. I think you both have experience of those industries, and you'll know how important that seems to be, being the kind of person who goes to the right dinner parties, or having lunch with the right people, or going to the right events, mixing with people who can give you a leg up. I think, it's very challenging, isn't it, if you're starting out and you don't have those contacts?
Does that resonate with you, Alex?
My story is slightly opposed, well, not slightly, but greatly opposed to Rhiannon's experience. I think it helped me that I was so naive. I had no absolute idea how this industry worked. And so when I used to submit my manuscripts, and bear in mind that in the mid-90s, 94, 95, 96, I would submit manuscripts that were handwritten. I didn't have an idea that you had to type it, double space, and so on. And I think that helped me, because if I knew of the barriers involved with someone like myself who had no connections, knew nobody in the biz, I think I would have probably given up. But I guess it was sheer verve that kept me going, because I used to call up publishing houses, receptionists, and say, well, how comes this editor hasn't got back to me? My novel's brilliant. Why are you publishing it? How comes I haven't got a £1 million deal? What's happening? And it was because of that, I think, that naivety, that lack of experience that kept me going in those early years. Because then, after a while, when I started to join writers' groups, and they used to tell me that, they've been trying to submit a novel to an agent for 5 to 10 years and still haven't been successful. I thought, oh my God, is that how long I'm going to have to wait? But I think I decided that, especially after hearing The Carry-All for Stephen King, he, I think, mentioned that he got rejected something like 50 times for Carrie. And I thought, okay, I'm going to stop submitting Bricks and Rock, my debut novel, when I get 50 rejections. I thought, well, if Stephen King can wait for 50 odd, then maybe I can too. But it really helped me that I didn't know anybody, I think, because if I didn't know all the barriers, the hurdles to overcome, me being a working class writer from my background, I think I would have been overwhelmed with, no, this is not industry for me.
I think that's like a really good point. I think you have to be really careful, don't you, that you don't put people off from trying, because, there were definitely times when I was hoping to be published where I just thought, oh, there's no point. And it's so easy to fall into that trap, I think. It's almost better to go out there with kind of wide-eyed enthusiasm.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I was. I was this wide-eyed boy that was so, I loved the whole writing experience. It helped me come to terms with my own childhood. I found it very therapeutic. And I remember speaking to friends of mine, and they kind of looked at me very strangely. Alex, you've written a novel? I mean, that is not for somebody like you. How comes you're not working on a building site or something very similar? But it was something that I had to get out of my system, if you like. I had this raging story inside of me that I wanted to tell. And even back then, I believed that the characters that I wanted to write about were just as valid as anybody else's. And I think it took me a long while to accept that, to validate myself, that to allow myself to actually write these stories, because sometimes the publishing industry can be seen as very middle class. I once remember somebody telling me, oh, but you haven't been to Oxford, so how dare you even attempt to write a novel? Who are you? That kind of, but I was very confident in a way that not so much my writing, but my characters and the story I wanted to tell, I felt was important enough. So I pushed on.
Yeah, I think a couple of things that really struck me there in that conversation is I remember talking to someone who had been in a writing classes with me in London, and she told me how that she got her book deal by being at a dinner party and sitting next to an editor of one of the big publishing houses, and she happened to mention she had written a book, and she's like, oh, send me the book. I mean, and one of the things about, I think, working class writers is they're not at those dinner parties. I mean, those shortcuts are rarely there. You're really struggling. You're there with your sort of your big sword, sort of cutting down the trees and making your own path for yourself. And I think that's part of the thing about these discussions now, and is they're cutting down wee paths or leaving wee trails of breadcrumbs for people coming behind and saying, listen, we've had these struggles, we've had these experiences, we've been told these things too, and here's, it's okay, you can make your way there. And I think, and then Alex, when you were talking, I was really thinking that, I think one of the things I've discovered, or one of the recurring topics of that come up when I've spoken to writers from a working class background is confidence. And you sound like you were very confident. And I mean, a lot of writers I know from working class background have come to it later in life. My first novel came out when I was 45. Kit de Vals was 55. There's like a kind of, oh, that's not for the likes of me. I don't have a seat at that table. I'm the guy clearing up the dishes afterwards. You know what I mean? I'm not sitting eating it out of that. You know what I mean? And I think that there's a real lack of confidence that can go along with coming from a working class background.
Absolutely.
There can be pressure from outside and within your own family and within your own peer group. You know what I mean? Like, what do you? If you putting your head up there, you'll be the first to get shot. You'll that kind of, don't try that. You'll make a fool out of yourself. And all very practical considerations, like there were 7 kids in my house, and 9 of us in 2 bedrooms or whatever. It's like you want to do what? You know what I mean? When you'll bring some money into the house, and that kind of pressure is there as well. I mean, and I think we don't see all the many ways that it sort of puts weight on you or keeps steering you into other directions. And you need to bring those up. I think
I asked you first, Rhiannon. What was the trigger that when you allowed to give yourself permission, validation, that you could own a story and write that story?
I think because I read from such a young age, that really opened up the world to me. And it really, my mum used to take me to the library every week, and you're allowed to take out 8 books, and I'd choose them really, really carefully, and, often read them very, very quickly and have to get more. And I just loved reading. And I think because I had that gave me permission to think that my characters and my stories would be of interest to somebody, just because I was faced with just the sheer diversity of literature when I was growing up. I think also kids' books, I think, children's books and YA tended to be more diverse than some of the adult novels on reading lists that, my peers were reading when we were students. I sort of grew up reading everything from like The Secret Garden to like Jacqueline Wilson, Mallory Blackman. It was this huge range of different authors with different life experiences. And I think that really, really inspired me. But I was just thinking about what you were saying about, writing your book set in Brixton. And my novel's set in North London. And that's a place that's very important to me. It's a place where I live, and it's a place where I was born. But it didn't even occur to me to write a novel that was set in a Welsh village. And I kind of wonder why that is. Was it that I thought in some maybe subconscious way that a novel set in North London would resonate more with editors than a novel set in a Welsh village? I don't know. I still haven't quite reconciled that part of my identity. I haven't written much in my fiction about Wales, and I haven't quite come to the point where I feel able to yet. And I sort of do wonder what's going on there.
Maybe because you're maybe more invested in North London than you are in that small village in Wales at this point in time. But that may change.
Yeah,
That may
definitely.
well change. But for me, I remember as a young boy in the children's home, some of the older boys would leave their magazines, and every Christmas, it seemed that every young boy in the children's home would get a gift of a football annual. And
Hmm.
these football annuals were Charles Buchan football annuals. Rhiannon, I'm probably going way before your time, but this is the late 60s, early 1970s. And when the older boys would finish with these annuals and magazines, I would pick them up, I'd put them beneath my pillow, and I'd read them at night. And that's what really accelerated my love of reading. And then I think it was Treasure Island that I found in the primary school one day. And I remember taking it home and reading that because I'd run out of football magazines and annuals. And from then, I always wondered, even at that age, when I was 8, 9, 10, that I wanted to read a fiction, read a narrative that included someone like me,
Mm.
someone like me. And I've always had that. Even when I went to Brixton, even when I went to prison when I was 18, I always felt that for reading, why isn't there more people like me or people who I knew? And
Hmm.
so that's how I approached Brixton Rock.
That's sort of inspired you to I
Absolutely.
guess if those stories aren't being told, then it's your job to tell them, you know?
Absolutely. Was there anything there that you could relate to, Paul, where you wanted ownership of your stories as well, your background, your experiences?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I remember giving up writing for a while in my probably late 30s and early 40s, and I came back to writing. And the reason I came back was because I felt like I hadn't told the story that I'd always intended to tell, which was this, my story, which was, I didn't see myself reflected in books when I was a kid. I was, a young working class Northern Irish boy um, with strange feelings towards both sexes when I just didn't ever hear anything like that explored in books. And I didn't hear the Northern Irish accent in books. No one spoke the way we spoke, and that really made me feel that we weren't meant to be in books, and also that or that our stories weren't worthy of being told or recorded. And I think that even as an adult, when I would read books about Northern Ireland, they tend to be, if they were working class, they were comically stereotypical, and it's a very broad and body, and the thing is, it's very close to what we are, but it's like it was like what was missing from that sort of darkly humorous, very broad, accented Northern Irish character was love, was any real emotion. They were just kind of figures of fun, and or mocked because they were so crazy and over the top, and was without any real kind of depth. And yeah, so definitely when I came back to writing, it was, I decided what I was going to do was write the book that I'd always intended to write, which is about growing up during the Troubles as a child, and growing up in fear, and what that was like, and doing it in my Northern Irish accent, and I really wanted to do that.
Yeah, Paul, it's very important because again, as a young boy growing up, and whenever I come across the Northern Ireland narrative, it was always about the friction between the two paramilitary armies. It was, and then maybe George Best and his narrative of coming from Northern Ireland and being a world superstar at football. But really, the everyday working class stories, they were denied for the rest of the UK. And so I always wondered what these stories were like, whether it was in Northern Ireland, Belfast, whether it was Glasgow. And I really do feel that over the past decades, we haven't had enough of those narratives to inform us about what life is really like living in those communities around the UK.
I agree. I agree. That's why it is important that we do tell these stories. I think that's a great question, actually. And I was just wondering then, how much do you think your background does influence what you write and continue to write? Rhiannon, what do you think?
I think, having been a carer, that wasn't something I'd written quite a lot about growing up with a sibling who had severe disabilities as part of my work for the newspaper, but it wasn't really something that I'd ever approached in fiction before. And I'm currently working on my second novel, and the protagonist of that novel is somebody who has been a child carer. And it sort of goes back to what you were both saying. I haven't read very much about that side of life, even though it's something that affects, thousands and thousands of children in this country and in other countries. So I think in terms of the issues that I approach in my writing, my background has been a really, really big factor. That's not to say that my work is autobiographical, but it's just, I'm quite interested in, for example, in this book, I'm quite interested in what it means to look after somebody else for such a long period of time, what that means for your own ambition and for your own formation as a creative person and as a woman, So that's what I'm looking at the moment. Whilst in my first book, my character, a bit like me, was somebody who fell a bit between the cracks. My character in my first novel is the child of hippies and grew up in kind of commune situations where they were moving around quite a lot. And so she sort of falls outside of the class system almost completely. And because of that, is encountering a lot of issues to do with class, particularly, in London, where, until I moved to London when I was a student, I hadn't really come across people who had that much money before. It was just crazy to me, like I hadn't even heard of John Lewis. And suddenly I was going to uni with all these people who were from like immensely privileged backgrounds. So I suppose there's a fascination with money there too, and what drives people who have money, and how those class differences manifest in everyday life. And I think that definitely comes from having not had very much money growing up. How about you guys?
Rhiannon, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was you who wrote an article about the injustice of tuition fees in The Guardian. Is that correct? Was that you?
Yeah, I've definitely written about that before, yeah.
So I can see from what I've read of you, and I have to admit, it's been mostly articles, fantastically written articles, by the way, that you have written. That there's a theme of injustice in your work, and that also informs me. I remember as a young boy, again, I keep going back to my childhood, but I think it's very important because what we see in those eyes, in those young eyes, kind of frames our thinking. And when I was 7 or 8, when we was allowed to go to the local shops, because sometimes you had to get permission, you had to get permission to go to the local shops as orphanage kids. And on occasions, the shopkeeper would allow anybody else in, apart from us orphan kids. So we were told to wait outside until all these middle class kids bought their sweets and whatever and went on their way. And we were told to do not go in, do not go in. And those kind of incidents stay with you. They really do. They frame your thinking of an unjust society. They really do. And when I went to Brixton, it was even more amplified because then colour came into the equation. I'm black, I'm young. And I was public enemy number 1 as well. So all those incidents, all those experiences, they frame the writing beast, I believe, and it certainly framed me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that, when you're growing up, how other people treat you, it really does shape you. And as they say, by the sort of age of 8 or 9, you're pretty much formed. And that's kind of you really and you can do lots of things to develop yourself, but you're sort of set, and I think, and I do think that a lot of people talk about this fluidity around class as well, because, you know, like you go to university to just by the fact of going, you're in some sort of transitionary phase out of your class, you know. And I had a very interesting debate, let's say, on Twitter a while back when I was tweeting something. Someone had said something in the Guardian or the Observer that, you know, my book was, you know, one of the working class books of the last while or whatever. And another author, you know, came in and was just so angry, you know, and was going, what's all this? Why are you going on about this thing? You know, we're authors now. We're not working class anymore. You know, I've got nice things in my in my kitchen or whatever, and my friends are okay. And I was like, well, you know, I'm not middle class now because I've written a book. You know what I mean? You know, I mean, most debut authors are getting about £1,000, you know, for their book. You know, and you know, £1,000, you know, for what I was working on on and off for 10 years. That's not any riches, you know. And you know, so I don't suddenly change my class, but there is a certain shifting, let's say. You know, you're not the boy you once were, you're not living the life you once were, you know. But how do you feel about that sort of movement out of or this sort of, I guess, not really being in either camp? You're not really working class anymore, but I vehemently get cross when people say I'm not, but I sort of recognize that I'm not the same as certain members of my family still or whatever. But also I don't ever feel that I would ever be middle class or could identify as that or had experience, because I've never lived it. Does that resonate?
Paul, I do find that very difficult at times. Sometimes I attend school reunions. Sometimes I see people who were friends of mine in the 80s, 90s, poor, I had nothing. I didn't have a novel in the shops. But now when I return to those spaces and those friends and people who I grew up with, and they see me as this author, and sometimes they, when I ask them about what they do, their families, their work and so on, they banter on and so on. And when it's my turn now, they cannot really connect to my narrative now or relate to what I'm telling them of my world. It's like I might as well be living on Mars sometimes. They just have a complete disconnect on occasions about what I'm trying to relate to them about my experiences being a published author. Because, you know, sometimes they see me on the news or a particular news program and so forth, and they feel a bit distant now, away from the Alex Wheatle who they knew, who they grew up with, who they partied with, who they drank and smoked with. So there's a bit of a distance there that I regret, because, as you say, I'm still that 7, 8, 9-year-old kid who loved comics, who loved reading, who and felt the injustice of the world. I haven't really changed from that, I believe.
I think there is definitely an assumption that you make lots of money if you're writing books and if you're going on the radio or if you're being a journalist or, you know, doing anything sort of in media and publishing. And as you said, you know, first debut novelists often don't get very big advances. And to sort of go back to what you were saying about working class Northern Irish novels, you know, when Anna Burns won the Booker Prize, that was a huge moment, not only because of what her novel was about, but also she thanked the benefits agencies that had supported her while she was writing the book. And I just, you know, as someone who kind of spent half their childhood on benefits, that was quite like an amazing moment to see somebody publicly acknowledge that, you know, they were a writer who'd won the Booker Prize, like the biggest prize you can win in this country. And they wouldn't have finished their book if they hadn't had help from the state. And that just felt so important in terms of not only being transparent about how little authors can earn, but also about the claiming of benefits. And, you know, it's just something that's been so stigmatized, particularly in the last decade or so.
Paul, I wanted to ask you, you live in London now, is that correct?
Oh, I did for 20 years, but I've moved back home recently.
So I'm just wondering, of your published experience, when you go into publishing houses, how many times do you hear your accent mirrored back to you?
Oh well, I mean, there's some very very small. I think there's one very small publisher here in the north, and I don't have anything to do with them. But in the UK, I don't think I ever heard that. And interestingly, I remember when you were talking earlier on about rejections, and I mean, my book was very heavily accented, and I did have to do a redraft because it was deemed not unpublishable, but I was more or less told that it wasn't going to happen, unless I changed it, and in fact when I changed it, I got a deal, but and then I remember saying this once at an event, and someone going, well, that's not true, look at Train Spotting, and I said, yeah, and that was 30 years ago. I mean, there's always the exception that proves the rule, and then you've got your one story that hold on, you got your book in an accent. How many do you want? It's that kind of that thing that people do, which I think is very interesting. That one voice that publishing sort of says is an example, and they use an example for the next decades. That's a working class voice that we had. So what more do you want, sort of thing,
So Rhiannon, do you believe that major publishing houses have now lost confidence in promoting and acquiring those heavily accented novels, like Irving Welsh Train Spotting, for example?
I mean, I don't know, because I'm not on that side of things, but I definitely know there's a lot of bullshit advice for writers that goes around, isn't there? And some of those rules, I can remember reading never write in dialect being one of those rules. And of course, there are some absolutely great works of literature, for example, Wuthering Heights.
Wuthering Heights, yeah.
Huge portions of dialogue that are in dialect. So I think
as well is really strong.
I think there's like a really strong absolutist strain of writing advice that tends to discourage that kind of thing. But I definitely think like the diversity of editors is a huge issue, because if you're somebody who has never encountered dialect and doesn't know how to read it, then you're much more likely to just chuck that manuscript aside than somebody who is able to appreciate the sophistication and the nuances of
absolutely
that register,
Yeah, it's I had a bit of a dilemma because writing Brixton Rock, where dialogue was kind of half-hearted, I didn't quite commit. But with my second novel, I thought, to hell with this, I'm going to go for it. And so I put in all the localisms, the slang, everything in Wasafiri Lane, and it got me on the map.
Yeah,
it got fantastically reviewed, and it really launched my career. So if there's any writers watching this and wondering what to do or how to approach a dialogue issue, I would recommend just go for it. Just write the book you want to write, and write in a dialogue that you feel comfortable with, and it will find a home.
I think also the human ear, the human brain as well, is very attuned to picking up speaking registers. So, all kinds of books that I've read where I've encountered language patterns that I haven't before, you eventually you fall into the rhythm of it, don't you, as a reader? So I don't think it's true at all that it's a barrier to readers, in which case, why should it be a barrier to editors?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think also, Rhiannon, what you were saying as well, it's not, and it isn't just about these editors not being able to, not liking these dialects and things, but their taste is also for people like them. They want to hear stories that reflect their lives. So if they're not from a working class background, it has less of an appeal to them, and because the issues aren't something that they've ever really concerned about. And I do think that working class people, like people of color, or like women. I remember I worked in comedy for years, and on every bill there was the token woman. You know, and women in comedy have such a hard time of it. I mean, it's disgusting, you know. And you know, there was a token person of color, you know, this kind of thing where, you know, it was real tokens. And I think in the industry and publishing, there's this token working class thing as well, you know. And I think you know, because there's a sort of image of what you can do, what you can be funny about, or what you can write about, and then you have to stay in your lane thing and write that. And we've got one of those already attitude, you know. When my novel was I got a review in the Guardian, and it was up for a prize, got another review, and the second reviewer was like, this book's just really like you know, Paddy Clark, ha ha ha, because it's about a boy who's poor in Ireland. You know, and so, like, you know, in other words, why do we need another one of these? And this is just a copy of that. And it didn't matter that my book was set 30 years later, that mine was set in Belfast, his was set in Dublin. Didn't matter that mine was set during a war and his wasn't. Didn't matter that mine was set about a boy who was born his sexuality and that wasn't. None of that mattered, because they were poor and they were from Ireland and they were a bit funny. So, you know, you did, and 30 years, like 30 years later, this book is like, you know, it does, yeah, there can be only one, that's it. And I think that happens to working class literature as well, you know, and, you know.
Yeah. And it's difficult to address, because many of the larger publishing houses, they're in central London, and I know there's one or two who are introducing new ways of recruiting. So in other words, there are some publishers who now just don't go for placement, 6-month placements, where somebody who wants to work in the publishing industry did not get paid. That happened a lot. So hopefully there's one or two now addressing that, because if you're not paying anybody to enter the industry, then you're only going to attract one demographic, aren't you? Those who can afford not to be paid. And so I think that was it's a serious issue in that industry that has to be addressed. And I know that one or two are addressing that. And I hope that debate doesn't end.
Yeah, there seems to be a big drive towards greater diversity in publishing, particularly in the last couple of years. And, you know, I've read interviews with numerous writers and editors of colour who basically say that they hope it continues, you know, that it's not just going to be a flash in the pan that then goes away when the next publishing trend comes along. And, you know, I really hope that too. And I think the London-centric point is a really good point as well, because it's, you know, it's Northern Ireland, it's Wales, it's Scotland, you know, there's a whole incredible range of voices that are out there waiting to be discovered. And, you know, it's the readers who lose out if we don't manage to reach those authors, or if those authors don't manage to reach those editors who can champion their work.
Absolutely. I know of editors who stalk anybody who's finished a UEA course, for example. But writers come from anywhere, from an oil rig off the North Sea to Southern Wales, to Northern Ireland, to a council estate in Brixton. You know, they can literally come from anywhere. So why aren't publishers spreading their net further afield?
I mean, I think there's some attempts to do that now, and I think that's really good. And I know there was was it called Right Now? And they were recently. I mean, I think it's now been postponed. Perhaps I'm not sure if that's true. Actually, because of the crisis, they were going to come to Belfast, and I think they did it the previous year, and chose a writer as well, and published their novel, and you know, so you know they're going around the country doing these events to try and encourage marginalized writers to, you know, and to find them, actively find them, and that's a massive thing, you know. And it's because it's not just saying, you know, hey, I've stuck something on my publishing in our website in London, you know, to say come and send us stuff. That's actually physically going to the regions and trying to engage with people and find people who wouldn't even normally even go on, you know, and look at their website to find that information out or whatever, you know. So I think that is really important. I mean, I think the Kit Duvall's anthology was massive. I think, you know, it was huge. I think it's a great impact. I think 5 of the authors now have got book deals, which is fantastic. But I thought also just it was so well thought out. I thought, because not only it was also the lovely details, like if they had an invitation to a literary festival, as well as having, of course, the literary festival is going to ask for all the big names, but they insisted that one of the new writers had to join them on stage, which I just thought that detail was just lovely, to get that experience and that exposure as well. So there's some great things happening, and as you said, Rhiannon, I mean, let's hope it isn't, just to satisfy the kind of, the fashion,
And just to pick up your point of Kit the Whale's anthology, and you think how they struggled to get the funding together to produce that book. And also, I couldn't help but think of the money publishers waste to acquire celebrity memoirs and so on. And we all know that 95% of celebrity memoirs do not make the outlay or make the advance of what they paid to the celebrity to write it. And to think of the millions and millions being wasted, and yet to see that Kit had to struggle to come up with, to acquire those funds to produce a book like that has been enormously successful. So sometimes I look at my industry and think, it's kind of broken. We need to readdress, reset, I believe.
She's a really good example as well, I think, of a writer who's paying it forward. And I think one of the things that I try and do, and that a lot of writers I know try and do, is mentor, other writers who are younger from disadvantaged backgrounds in order to help give them a little bit of confidence, I think. And, I think that's a good way of encouraging writers from diverse backgrounds to put themselves forward as well. Is sometimes all it takes is just having one person saying, this is good, keep at it, you should send this in, you've really got something here. I think it's extra important for working class writers that they get that support.
Yeah, and I think if because I guess we're kind of coming sort of towards the end, and to sort of try and encourage people, because it is a serious conversation, and and we of course want to highlight the problems. But I think talking a little bit about this these opportunities that are out, there are a number actually now, whether to be published or whether it's to get into the industry, or whether it's free. I've noticed, like, for example, courses offering free, places and things like that, competitions that charge to compete, they're offering, say 40 free entries and things like that. All of those things are really important. And also, I'd just like to mention, just in this particular crisis that we're in, there are emergency funds available for Society of Authors. I just got my email today. You drink some, Paul. You want to rhyme here? I just got mine. But I just wanted to say that, that there are, if you are now sitting as an author and thinking, I've just lost a load of money, and which, from live events or teaching or wherever you make your money, that there are lots of things. The Arts Council of England and Northern Ireland now are doing schemes, but also the Society of Authors you can turn to for support. And should that be something that you need now, don't be embarrassed or about it at all. I mean, I'm doing it.
Yeah.
Any tips you guys could give closing up now about or last minute thoughts?
Last minute thoughts. Writing is good for our health. Reading and writing is good for our health. I remember how much it helped me as I was going up into adolescence, and how I dealt with my own mental health issues that I had from the repercussions of coming out of a care system. And so I really support what Mind are doing with this program, with this event. Is it stopped? Is it still there? I'm seeing something at the bottom. Hopefully it'll be edited out.
I would do that.
So this is why we need such diverse writing out there, because we sometimes forget that what we produce, what we write about, the things that are precious to us, can be precious to somebody from the tip of Mull of Kintyre to Land's End. We just don't know who we're affecting when we're writing our narratives, and where we put our heart and soul into these narratives, and people will pick up those books, those stories, and feel comforted in a way, and see that they are recognised and their lives are important, and we should not forget that.
Thank you.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I'd say, you know what, everything that Alex said, I think, you know, literature has the potential to make us all feel less alone, and to read of others' experiences and to read about characters that resonate with us, you know, has real transformative potential. So I guess what I'd say is, if there's anybody watching who's not got to the stage of being published yet, but that, you know, desperately hopes that will happen, all I'd say is, you know, keep at it and enter as many competitions as you can. Competitions are a great route into publication for people who don't have those contacts, and you know, just keep writing, because I think all of us write ultimately because we have to. Certainly not for the money. I mean, because for most people that just does not happen, you know, as you said, Paul. So I just think, you know, if it's something that you care that passionately about, that will come through in the writing, and it's something that you just have to keep at, no matter how dispiriting it can feel at times. And we've all been there, haven't we?
Yeah.
All of us.
Absolutely. We listen. Thank you very much to Alex Wheatle and Rhiannon Lucy Cosslett, and to everyone for joining BookBound 2020 for this event. There are lots of great events like this on our program. You can search for BookBound 2020 on Twitter and Instagram to learn more and help us spread the word using the hashtag BookBound 2020. If you'd like to buy books from us or that we've written, there's links in the text below the video, and we'll take you through the Hive, an online bookseller which supports independent bookshops. Links to books discussed here and a discount code and selected festival titles are below. You will also find our authors' favourite independent bookshops across the globe. They've also let me know here that they put a link to bursaries and competitions in the description below as well. And you can also find the Just Giving link to donate to the chosen charity of Mind supporting mental health below. Okay, thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.